Hello and welcome back to Car Design Dialogues Asia. We are very pleased to have you with us. Now, before I introduce my next session, I'd just like to remind you to make full use of our networking platform and the chat function and make contact with some of your fellow guests and viewers and perhaps even some of our sponsors. Onwards now to traditional forms contemporary design, which is our next session. Now, there was a time when it was possible to identify a car or where it was designed by its aesthetic cues: American muscle cars, Italian style, and French eccentricity. Today, we live in a world which is fit with further-reaching possibilities, but one that somehow feels slightly smaller. Organic ideas are often consumed by the globalized ideal. How then to fashion a strong design identity? And how much does design heritage and culture have a role to play? Well, here to explore some of these questions are Kripa Ananthan, who's head of design at Mahindra & Mahindra, Gautam Sen, who's a journalist and author, and Fabio Filippini, who is a car designer and a design consultant and has a company, Akafe, I think? No, I've got that wrong, Fabio. Akafe. Thanks very much, and apologies for mangling that so flawlessly. Okay, guys, thanks very much for coming to Car Design Dialogues Asia. Really pleased to have you with us. Kripa, I'm going to start with you, actually, if that's okay. And I wondered if you could give us an overview of the Indian design scene at the moment from your vantage point at head of design at Mahindra.
I'd like to talk about a few aspects. There are some great designers doing fantastic work in India. Other than my esteemed colleagues in the Indian automotive OEMs, they are independent designers. I'd like to name a few: Ashish and Ashwini, Elephant Design, Michael of Foley Design, Latika and Freedom Tree, and so many others. They're doing fundamental work driven by insight, shaped by knowledge of form and function, materials, technology, and most importantly, courage of conviction. The second thing is there is a wave of consumer involvement or co-creation. There are so many ideas, suggestions, comments, movements online that are defining and shaping future design possibilities. And the third thing is there's a fantastic design pool now. There are these wonderful young designers who study in local design schools or in international design schools, and boundaries are sort of ceasing to exist, who have a lot of fresh ideas and are contributing to the design scene at the moment.
It's interesting you mentioned there there's a greater connection there with perhaps the consumer and the people that are using these vehicles. Is that helping to create or form a more sort of organic or design scene that's a little bit more in tune with a sense of place?
Definitely. I don't think anymore it's designers sitting in our ivory towers saying what is good design, but it's being pushed and shaped by this dialogue that is happening with consumers, with other interested designers, with content creators, influencers. It's now more a dialogue and less me to you.
Fabio, that's an interesting question for you. I think this idea of a bit more of a shared kind of ideal or more of a dialogue around design rather than the sort of traditional ivory tower idea. Is that something that resonates with you in your work?
Well, for sure, it's something very important because it's part of the contemporary society and even more of the society to come. This multicultural mixing and sharing aspects. The point is to find probably the best and positive aspects of this sharing thing, but at the same time being able not to lose the very typical expression of every specific culture. So there might be some basic common, I wouldn't say mainstream, but some basic common fundamental structure for a design vision, or for maybe a global trend. But then on top of that, there is a lot of opportunity still, I think, for local expression or cultural specific expression, where design can express, in fact, the origin, either Indian, which is such a strong cultural identity, Italian, American, English, French, and so on. So I think probably now we are a bit too much on this sharing things and losing a little bit the feeling and the touch of our own internal specific cultures. But probably there will be a way to balance better this in the future. I hope so.
And Gautam, you've been covering car design, writing about car design, multiple books under your belt. You've written about all sorts of stuff, Italian masters and also magazine articles. Are you? What place do you see a country's culture in having in car design, contemporary car design?
Well, there's a history to go with. The fact that obviously, if you talk about the major car-making nations, so specifically the European ones like Italy and the UK, Germany and France, as well as Japan and the US, they have obviously a huge history. And a lot of the brands today, or the marks, or the reasons why people go and buy a Fiat Cinquecento is the Fiat 500 is because of the history, because today it's a retro design which goes back to the original Cinquecento. So the fact that there was already, the fact that the history of the cultural aspect that went into the design of these cars, which distinguished them from each other, from the country to country in the 50s, 60s, 70s, still reflects in the kind of design that you see today. And the fact that somebody prefers one over the other, why does somebody go and buy a Mini versus buying, let's say, a more modern or a Toyota Yaris, is obviously also an aspect of reflection of sometimes the design and what it stands for. So there is, I think, the fact that there is greater, let's say, globalization. Today, most designs are similar across the globe, yet there are models and versions and variants which do distinguish, and which is what makes that particular model different from the rest, and why that is successful and why something else isn't. So I do think that the cultural aspect still plays a very important role, despite the fact that globalization has brought about, let's say, a certain similarity in form, styles, and shapes. Yet the fact that there is certain, let's say, design DNAs that some of the products carry on from the past reflects in the success or the lack of success in some cases today.
It leads into another interesting question, which I think is interesting, or pertains to this point. This idea about there's a fine line between doing something retro and doing something that's pastiche. And I wondered, Gautam, and this is actually a question for all of you guys, how to tread that line, a very delicate line.
Well, that's a very interesting point, and that's where some models and some cars, or some, let's say, redesigning or reimagining of a design that goes back to the historical references is successful and does well, and in some cases is not at all successful and does badly. The new Beetle versus the Fiat 500 versus the Mini versus the Ford Thunderbird, the 6th generation, which failed because it just didn't seem to appeal. So yes, when the Lamborghini Miura concept came up, and it kind of got a lot of negative, let's say, press, because people didn't think that it should have been revisited. The Miura shouldn't have been. So yes, it is. I think that's a very, very interesting point, and what works and why didn't, and what doesn't work and why didn't it work? And that's, I think that's worth probably a book itself, in terms of the fact that how is it that some of them have worked so well, and in some cases they're seen as cheesy or dismissed as being something that is people didn't seem to take to it. So I think it's treading a very fine line, and that's where I guess the designers have to, and I'm sure Fabio probably and Kripa, both of them probably have a point of view on this as to what makes what works and what doesn't work in these revisiting what you call our design icons.
Fabio, the gauntlet has been thrown down. How do you do it?
Yeah. But maybe Kripa, if she wants to start, then I can follow back.
So I know I saw the gauntlet.
Ladies first.
Ladies first. Yeah.
So
I was trying to be polite.
Simple answer, but the one thing that I can suggest is that with the changing context, the form has to evolve. I'm not talking about the full volume or the full vehicle, but let's say you're taking a particular detail in a traditional facade, which is some intricate detail in a building, and you're applying some form of it. That's the inspiration onto a vehicle, which is a modern, 2022 vehicle. But that has been made its sandstone, that detail, and you're using modern plastic. So you have to change that form, adapt it, make it more modern, and make it suitable for this material, for this process, polypropylene injection molding. It cannot be cut paste, but it has to be applied in this context. So the only thing I can think of is how do you apply to the changing context? How do you?
Yeah. So, for example, I'm listening to those comments, and I fully agree. At the same time, I can say I'm in a sort of privileged point of view for this subject, because being here in Japan and having been in Japan more than 30 years ago, I could see, for example, at the Tokyo Motor Show, the presentation of the famous Pikes car from Nissan from the middle 80s. Like the B1, the Pau, the Escargot, and the Figaro. And there was a moment in which globally, the global creative culture, not only talking about car design, the global creative culture was completely transformed the society in a postmodern society. So there was the transformation of the society, and the global creative culture was really inspired by that. So those cars were the first real attempt and strongest, probably so far, expression of postmodern approach. In fact, they were not repeating cars as they were, but they were taking cues and elements of classic cars and putting it together just to play with the nostalgic aspect, sort of undefined nostalgic aspect, because probably they didn't want to repeat exactly a classic car. But having that example gave the start to all of this new fashion, this fashion of retro design. Because after that, the Beetle came out, the Mini, the Fiat 500, and all of the others. So basically, those original postmodern concept, undefined postmodern concept, gave the opportunity to company with their history to get back to some strong iconic cars and repeat them. Now we are going through even a much more complex period, because we can see, if we look on the web, on YouTube or whatever, we can see almost thousands and thousands of young design students playing with the past. And also we can see a lot of passionate people doing resto mode. So there is a sort of, the past has been completely almost banalized. It is something that everyone can do and play with it, which is good in a certain way, but at a certain moment it becomes quite superficial. So if you play with something from the past, you better try to keep also the value, or to make evolve the value, and not just the superficial aspects. And also, as Kripa was saying, a designer should always look ahead and not just on the back. So if you take something from the back, you take it to make a new leap ahead. And you have to be conscious of that, basically.
In fact, if I may button here, I say that sometimes I wonder, as somebody who's not a designer and who is more an observer and a chronicler of what's happening, is sometimes the legitimacy of it all. When Fiat does the Fiat 500 or Mini does the Mini, it's fine. It's their own history. They're recreating, they're reimagining, they're repositioning their own history. But when you have a situation where a car like the Lancia Stratos, for instance, what do you say? HKF. The Lancia Stratos HKF. Now that, when it gets reimagined, not by the original designer, not even by the original design studio or the house, but Pininfarina reimagined something done by their rival once upon a time, Okay, and that gets reintroduced as a new Stratos. What's the legitimacy of this? And it's like almost you're hijacking somebody else's history for your own, let's say, personal, whatever it could be, commercial benefit or etc., etc. So there is, I think, there is also the aspect of legitimacy, and it's interesting when you mentioned Fabio, when you mentioned about Nissan and the cars like the Figaro and the Escargot as an example, which obviously is a beautiful reference to the Citroën Doshevo, which is not theirs, right? Or if you look at the success of the Mazda Miata, which is again clearly a reimagining of the Lotus Elan, but in a much probably better way, in a way, whatever. And it's eventually the most successful roadster in history. Now that in itself is an interesting situation. Now, what is the legitimacy of it all? Is it now Mazda? Now everyone acknowledges the MX-5, the Miata as Mazdas, but the fact of the matter remains that it actually did what it did was to reimagine what was the Lotus Elan. So this is the other question I'd like to ask. I mean, sorry, James, I've kind of hijacked whatever you were planning to ask. The legitimacy of these, when you appropriate somebody else's history, what do you decide?
It does feed into this idea of cultural memory and how that does inform where you're going, and they're definitely so. Because you're actually, we are singing from a similar hymn sheet there, because I suppose it leads into this idea of new markets, of China in particular is trying to sort of almost invent a kind of car design culture, and you see some of the designs coming out of there, and they're kind of they're retro in a sense, but they're retro referencing a kind of period that they didn't actually go through. You can go through a period of kind of modernism or postmodernist design, as Fabio was mentioning there. But what do you do, or where are the frames of reference, and how do you nurture a kind of design culture where, in the past, there historically hasn't been this lineage? Kripa, that may be one you might want to jump in on.
Yeah, while I understand the validity of what Gautam is saying, and James, what you're saying is really relevant for India. We are a young nation, and we don't have a automotive past to lean on, or a automotive heritage design heritage to pull from, and that culture is evolving. So it is important to seek inspiration from. It could be nature, it could be architecture, it could be somewhere else, but sometimes it could be other popular forms, automotive designs. So while I agree with Gautam that it is cultural misappropriation, I think if it's done with an intent of infusing something that's yourself, your either your Indianness or your brand or your customer, and then if it's successful, I think it should be allowed, and if it's not an overt copy, it should be fine.
So if I may button once again, which I keep doing, James is said, "Oh, what the hell am I doing here?" No, Kripa. Well, we are getting to the topic which is closer to your territory and your heart, I presume, and that's why we're coming to the product like the Mahindra Thar. I do think that there is a certain legitimacy there, because for India, the Jeep CJ3, which was eventually sold as a Mahindra CJ3 in the 50s and the 60s, and subsequently the MM540, which was the evolution of the CJ3, they are very much, in fact, probably have a greater significance in the Indian context eventually than it's had in North America. We're not talking the Jeep from the Second World War. That's another. I mean, the GP, which was made by Ford, Bantam, Willys, is another that has its own. That's American. But the 50s and 60s Mahindras is as much a part of India's, let's say, automotive history as much as the Vespa scooter, which is otherwise the Bajaj, is in India's automotive history. And if you look at the Indian three-wheelers, like
it's an interesting point, because it's that product is part of our culture, in our popular culture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
It ties up with Fabio's point about nostalgia, retro nostalgia. So there are lots of things that you have to reinterpret or bring into the modern world, which have a deep traditional. In this sense, it may not be traditional, but it's from your past, and it needs to be reinterpreted in the future. So Fabio, I mean, I think we're coming back to your point, and if you feel that you'd like to add to it.
Well, well, first I would like just to make a little note to Gautam before comment, because, for example, the two examples he quoted, like the new Stratos, I think it was a very nice object on its own, and it was very correct from a philological point of view, from an historical point of view, and that's a good thing. Even though it could be looking a little bit bizarre that a Bertone car was then developed by Pininfarina, but it is much more, I would say, legitimate to be doing something like that in Torino from a big carrozzeria, if it's not the same, but doing it also in that way with a very high level of reinterpretation, but at the same time being faithful to the original spirit. And also is a very nice piece of work. So, and the Miata is a different approach. So it's like taking inspiration and then having the freedom of doing something that takes that inspiration to a new era and to a new level. And it's probably what related to what Kripa is saying about how, for example, a company in India can do with his own past or with some iconic cars that had a lot of meanings for Indian culture or for Indian people. So there is the legitimacy to do it, as far as you just don't do a sterile copy or replica, which can have some sort of market maybe meaning, but from a design point of view, it's always good to take something from the past, to take the important value and being able to translate, to make them evolve, to go ahead. That's and every culture, every strong culture, even if it doesn't have an historical automotive culture, could always find something to inject in their own projects, in their own new cars, and to define a strong identity, a strong cultural identity.
I think that's a really interesting point, Fabio. And Kripa, going to you about this idea. You mentioned that India didn't have necessarily the same lineage in terms of automotive design, but it does. India has an incredibly rich culture beyond just cars. So I wonder if there are elements that you look to outside of automotive design, just within the sort of wider cultural context.
True. Sometimes when we talk about a car design, it becomes about the exteriors. But you know, there is interior design, there is UI, UX, there is color, material, finish, and designers look for inspiration, get inspired by product, by furniture. We have a strong history of furniture, fashion. Indian fashion is world famous, and fabric, Indian fabric is design. Has been doing very, very good work for a very long time. And of course, architecture, where we have a lot of traditional form. And I think Fabio spoke about it earlier. It's amazing how Japanese designers lean on their heritage of painting, say. So I do think that some fundamentals, even of exterior design, you can learn by looking at our traditional sculpture or architecture, because it's about studying proportions, balance, stance, and these are universal for design. We are working with inspiration from nature. For example, can you capture that ephemeral quality of sand movement over dunes? Our Mahindra Thar is a desert going vehicle. It's inspired from a desert. So there are inspirations in nature. It's a infinite source of inspiration, and that does work for Indians over and above having a heritage of car design.
Kripa, staying with you, actually, you did bring an example of the new launch on the horizon of Mahindra this year, the XUV 700, and maybe this is an opportune moment to roll that, or we'll explain a little bit about the clip we're about to see, or we can just roll that and discuss after?
So, no, you could roll the clip.
A sunroof so large, you might think you're in a convertible. Hello, largest in segment Skyroof. Hello, XUV 700.
Wonderful. Brief, to the point.
Yeah, so, we were in India, sunroofs are loved, and we wonder, what is this about sunroofs that Indians love? And we were thinking that traditionally it could be courtyards, inner courtyards in our houses we had, where it's a melting pot. Everybody comes in, and you have this open space above you, and you're united inside the house. Maybe there is some nostalgia connected to that aspect of your past, and that's one of the reasons why I have this like humongous sunroof, panoramic sunroof. And when you're sitting inside, you just feel together in the car, and at the same time at one with the world. And I'll stop with that, and I'll give others a chance to talk.
No, it's a good point. I wondered whether there is, and we talk about the value of design history and having this kind of the lineage of historic models to look at and styling movements and things like that. But Fabio, maybe this is a question for you. When does this design heritage, when does it become baggage?
Yeah, I mean, I can say I've been luckily experiencing the fact of working for a company who has a very strong and historical, heritage to develop, to take advantage of it, or to make evolve and develop. When you say baggage, what is that? Is a positive or a negative aspect? Because maybe that is a
negative normally, Fabio.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
but until it is a fitted baggage.
Okay. So I mean, it becomes a burden, basically.
Exactly, Fabio.
Okay.
Kind of
well, it's a delicate aspect, because you can, having a long, a big heritage, it's in a certain way an advantage, in the other way it could be a burden, a baggage, because you have to be able to take the advantage of it, to use it as a playground or as a fundamental base to work on it, but not being completely overwhelmed by the weight of it. So you have to be able to play with that in order to develop further. For example, think about the classical music. The classical music orchestra director today, they are still playing with the orchestra the same music that Beethoven composed two centuries ago, but they are not doing it exactly in the same way, and everyone is interpreting and is trying to make it evolve, or is trying to give a particular flavor or sensitivity to it. So it's not just being strict and not moving out of the box, not moving out of a defined space that you cannot do a grid that you cannot do anything. So you have to find the right balance on that.
If I may add to that, I do think there are a few things that have to move with time. Let's say wheel sizes, better materials, build quality. So you cannot say the past design had small wheels and big rubber, and hence I will keep to that. So there are certain things that are hygiene and have to change. And so you have to be very careful on saying what is the strength of the design which you're reinterpreting from the past, and let go of the rest of it.
Thanks, Kripa. We're approaching the end now, so I'm just going to throw one more question out to each of you, and it alludes a little bit to what Fabio was talking about earlier. We've gone through ideas of modernism. We've gone through this kind of this postmodernist reaction where we saw kind of retro elements come in, and that was a very strong moment. But is it possible to define what era we are in now? Got it. Maybe I'll start with you, then Kripa, and we could end with Fabio, perhaps.
What era? The thing is, actually, I wanted to go back to what Kripa said, and maybe I'll kind of elaborate upon that. And the fact that when she was talking about tradition and aspects about India's past and India's heritage, she mentioned about fabric. And the fact of the matter is that fabric, I mean, if you look at fabric design in India, what's very typically Indian is the paisley. And you may know that you probably, James, you know better than anybody else, that Paisley is a little town in Scotland. And that's where Paisley came from. So the fact of the matter remains that we kind of keep, globalization is not just a phenomena from all of yesterday or just these days. It goes back centuries. So I think when we're looking at it, we're saying, talking about the current situation in the future, the fact of the matter remains is that the fact that this whole whirling situation of cultural interfaces, which is globalization and which takes us to the fact that we must sometimes forget the past and talk of only the future. I think it's kind of always evolving. There are moments of evolution, and at the same time there are moments of revolutions, and we're able to work together towards the fact that design itself, on one side there will be certain aspects which will keep evolving, and there'll be other once in a while situation which designs or concepts are complete revolutions, and that can take you further into the future. And I think the aspect of electric and EVs and all that gives us an opportunity for another revolution probably into the future.
Wonderful. Kripa?
I don't think it'll be one single style, one global style, James. I think there would be a multiplicity. I think modern technology would enable expression. And so that's what I think the future would be, where you are dipping into your past, but there would be a multiplicity of styles to cater to different needs and desires.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kripa. And Fabio?
Well, Kripa took away the word from my lips, actually, multiplicity. I think we are in a area of big changes, and multiplicity is the most important word today. The multiplicity is also coming from many different factors that before were more stable for long periods. So we have probably to be able to read those changes and not just to follow them critically and just being caught into a sort of whirling situation. And we just, multiplicity doesn't mean getting everything at the same time. It means being able to read the difficulty, to read the multiplicity, to separate things, to analyze and pick up and build up something. So probably in this period is exactly the period where all of this